Okay, I think it's time to call to order the 46th meeting of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission on Tuesday, January 17th. Welcome, everybody. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Commissioner McHugh.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the minutes have been distributed. They were distributed yesterday. I received from Director Durenberger one suggested correction on page 5 of the minutes. I have in the next to last paragraph a sentence that reads, "The current system," that's the system of earmarking monies, "is cumbersome and expensive," and he stated that the racing division is close to recommending that the commission scrap the system and set up a fund for capital improvements for those who need targeted earmarked takeouts. And her suggestion was that that be explained by saying that it was focused on those who, that the monies would go to improve the working conditions of occupational licensees and those who live at the tracks. And I think that's a better and more, a much better description of what we're talking about there. So okay. I would move the, if there are no other comments.
Any other questions or edits or anything?
I'd move the acceptance of the minutes with that correction.
Second.
Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Nay, opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Okay, item number 3, administration. We generally look at the schedule, but I think the only thing that I could think of, we know there's a lot of work going on in the area of the time frame for background checks and the regs, in order that we can try to move this process along as quickly as possible. We're working on both the green line, which is as many as 6 months for background checks, hoping we can get them in more like 3, and also looking at the regs process. But we talked about that last week. I don't think there's really anything to add. The only thing that I know to add is that Commissioner Zuniga and I are working on a draft of a job description for a director of research and compulsive gambling. We haven't really talked about that yet, but when we get the job, we've sort of talked about it a little bit, but when we get the job description, we'll bring it and talk about it. But I think that's something, Janice, you might make a note to tell Eileen that we'll put on, just add to the hiring. Other than that, I don't think there's anything really going on in terms of the master schedule since last Tuesday night. Anything else in administration? Commissioner Zuniga, anything that you wanted to talk about? Okay. Application process. This is sort of a catch-all topic at the moment. We have been working for the last 9 months in a substantial part to assure that we had a competitive environment. We've all talked about it on the theory, A, that this is what the legislature wanted, and B, a competitive environment would assure the best possible set of proposals from the various folks in the field who are going to be bidding. We now, excuse me, we now clearly have that competitive environment, and our focus is going to start to turn to what are the criteria that we're going to use to make the decisions. It's obviously going to be the regs that we're writing. But now we want these competitors to know what it is that we really care about, and what are the major values, what are going to weigh the most, what are our aspirations for what these might really look like. Commissioner McHugh, as everybody knows, is working on a draft of an initial evaluation tool, which we will be looking at probably in the next couple weeks. But also you have a memo that I distributed just to sort of be a blue sky document to start thinking about what else the legislature directs us to think about, other criteria beyond those which are articulated in the legislation. And this memorandum articulates some of the things that I think are important. I do actually want to read a little bit of this because I think it's important to put it into the record, and it'll start the conversation going. So if you'll bear with me, there are a couple of points that I want everybody, including all of the bidders, to be aware of. However, I think this point bears constant reinforcement. The high-impact dollars from gaming that flow to the Commonwealth, both in discretionary spending and incremental tax revenue, are either those that are repatriated from out of state, the $900 million or so that apparently is now gambled in other states, or that is brought into the Commonwealth from out of state, money that is redirected from other discretionary spending within the Commonwealth if is of little or no real value, and will likely be a heavy cost to some other business or institution such as the lottery. Consequently, we want to do everything we can do so that our casinos are maximally, truly destination resort casinos that are attractive to folks from other states and folks from out of the country. To do this, we need to influence the developers to design features and strategies that will help attract outsiders, create synergies with our other major travel and tourism institutions, Massport, the Convention Authority, the hospitality industry, tourism attractions, Mott, etc., and perhaps even look for synergies with our other key industries, healthcare, higher education, life sciences, venture capital, financial services, etc., that can be combined with a destination resort casino to attract larger than expected numbers of gamblers and tourists from out of state and out of country. In a related issue, we're encouraging casino developers to add amenities that will enhance the broader tourism goals of the Commonwealth. Commissioner Cameron and I recounted how the casinos in Singapore had phenomenal additional features. One had a convention center and an art museum, while the other had an MGM Universe theme park and a fabulous aquarium. We obviously don't have that kind of leverage, but we do need to think strategically about how we can maximize such related and enhancing facilities. As the competitive environment for our licenses now is established, this may be the time to begin to articulate these objectives. And then I laid off a bunch of ideas of the kinds of things that I think would be wonderful related amenities and steps that could be taken, and I'm hopeful that other folks will have other ideas. Understanding we're in the brainstorming mode right now. Eventually, we will reduce this to hard criteria, but this will start to give the sense of the kinds of things that we really care about. So were there other people have reactions to the notion or particular ideas that we might focus on?
I think this is really critical. The gaming statute is clearly designed to create destination resorts with the thought in mind that we're going to bring in out-of-state dollars. And I think that this memorandum captures that notion nicely. The examples are good, but I thought that the three questions on page 3 of the memorandum, specifically, what is the Boston or Western Massachusetts brand, and how can developers merge their product positioning and marketing with those brands? What kind of tourism attractions don't we have that a developer could produce? And what assets do we have in the casino regions that can be leveraged by strategic relationships with the casinos? I thought those were examples of really important questions, and that, for me, the question was, how do you get responses, creative responses to those questions? There may be others that fit into the same category. And allow the creativity and the energy of the developers to be brought to bear on trying to outdo each other, if you will, in answering those kinds of fundamental questions. And I have some thoughts about that when we get to the matrix and how we're going to evaluate things. But I think that's really important.
Yeah.
To capitalize on their energy as well as to contribute our own thinking to how these things look in concrete examples.
Right.
Yep, I agree with the notion as well. I think we've talked about how one aspect of creating destination resorts is emphasizing perhaps creativity by developers in differentiating their product, in having a good product, how that fits with the Commonwealth, but what makes the product unique. And as we tease out those questions and criteria that we are in the process of fine-tuning, if you will, and being more descriptive about, I think questions along those lines that are broadly articulated in the statute, but clearly to the extent that this commission can emphasize the importance of that, by relative weight of the criteria, for example, or by pre-requiring certain things would be an important step towards that goal.
I like, as Commissioner McHugh pointed out, these 3 questions on the last page. We've talked all along about trying to get applicants to think outside the box. If these are truly to engage visitors from outside of the region or outside the country to come to Massachusetts. Throughout the statute, there are strong linkages made to tourism. And posing these 3 questions, one might encourage an applicant to begin to focus on building a relationship, as we've talked about, with the local regional tourism. I mean, figuring out what the Western Mass brand is, it would help if you had a conversation with the Western Mass Visitors Bureau and their visitor entities out there. I was struck by the article, I think, in the Globe this week that talked about efforts to encourage visitors from China through direct flights or whatever Massport and Mott are working on, but encourage applicants to foster that discussion. Let's look at what Mott's and Massport's long-term strategy is for reaching out to South America, to Japan, direct flights. Let's see how an applicant may be able to fold that into their plans. So if we can help design a facility that will be attractive to a potential gamer from Brazil or Japan. I mean, there's so many places that we can find partnerships, and even on the revenue end, where we know we dedicate money to tourism funds, some plan or some strategy potentially coming from this commission to say these monies are obviously appropriated by the general court, but maybe give some suggestions, recommendations as to how that money can be spent wisely to not only improve, obviously, the tourism economy, but make sure that we have that robust gaming industry that we're looking for.
Yeah, and I was, in reading your memo, Mr. Chair, thinking back to Singapore and how they felt like they did not have anything architecturally that people would travel there to see. They didn't have any kind of a building that people thought, and that was one of their goals, to create a casino resort that architecturally would draw folks from around the world. That was interesting. And the other thing is the waterfront. I mean, if their second facility is on the water, and they took advantage of that with the whole waterfront. You mentioned the aquarium, but the whole waterfront resort with all of those amenities that, whether it be jet skiing or private beach cabanas, they took advantage of the waterfront. And I know that other resort casinos, I know that some of them in Atlantic City have really emphasized the ocean and shopping mall that looks like a ship. So I really was struck with the same idea that taking advantage of whatever it is here, and there's so many things here that are unique or bring tourism in, taking advantage of it is a good idea.
Did you learn whether the Singapore authorities came up with the idea that an architecturally stunning building would be the draw, or whether that was the product of applications?
They wrote it into, they wanted, that was one of they clearly laid out what they wanted ahead of time, and so that was one of the ideas that they would judge the proposal. That was one of the.
But in the case,
architecturally,
correct.
Well,
They-
but
spectacular
the-
building.
Well, but the Adelson building is an incredible building. The casino in the other one, in the Genting facility, is nondescript, it's.
But they only wanted one. They wanted one on the waterfront.
Oh, that was spec there?
incorporated-
Oh, okay, I
correct,
didn't
and then
remember
the
that.
second one they wanted in town with a building that was spectacular.
The other thing that I don't remember we talked about when we came back from Singapore, the casino licensing process was conducted by the Tourism Bureau. There wasn't a gaming commission. They set up a gaming commission later on to do the regulating. But this was about tourism. It was basically saying, okay, we know that you can make a lot of money in the casino business here. Fine, we're going to give you a license to do that. What we want you to do is fulfill our objectives as a privilege, as a way to win this license. And
Well, one of the things that we have on our plate for next week is putting together the team that will need to evaluate proposals, and that the identity of the team, or not the identity, but the characteristics of the team members may itself underscore the importance of various facets of what it is that we're looking at. And so that's something, it seems to me, we need to think about as an incentivizing tool as we put that together, so we can get some help really evaluating the things that are important to us and doing comparative analyses.
Part of what I'm wrestling with is what's the process by which we articulate whatever this is that we come up with? And I think just talking about it amongst ourselves and in the public so that participants, bidders can hear us thinking, people will learn what we're thinking about. But that's going to need to be regimented to some extent. And, I want, for example, should we invite people to comment on ideas? Should we have an educational forum or a hearing where we kind of lay out this kind of extended reach idea, particularly the attraction of the incremental kinds of attractions and attracting people from out of state, and invite people to come in and give their ideas. I'm sure there's plenty of people working to help fix Springfield or resurrect the Mystic River watershed or fix the wetlands around Suffolk East Boston or whatever, would that be a constructive idea to get other ideas that we could then incorporate into our process?
I think it would be. If we work back from the evaluation criteria to the things that we're looking for in the application, it seems to me that's the real way we have to go. And put in the evaluation criteria various things that will incentivize people to respond to the themes we think are important without stifling them through specifics.
Right.
Right. And then put together a team that's competent to help us evaluate the responses, and then have some discussion about what we put together as an evaluation platform. That might be the most...
Have a public discussion, you mean?
Yeah.
With that evaluation?
I mean, we've done in the past, we've almost uniformly created some idea, at least on the big things.
And then ask for comment.
And then asked for comment, and before we even get to the regulation drafting stage, so that we can get the input from those.
Right.
And then maybe, Mr. Chairman, a public forum of some kind to talk about that as well, to encourage it, but have this a really good participatory process from a lot of people with good ideas.
I want to emphasize the tools that we have, and I always assume would be the main thrust of how we do this. The response form, the criteria by which people are going to be evaluated in some detail, in some granularity. I know this is broad. There's many of the broad criteria is articulated already in the statute, but our interpretation of that needs to be interpreted. And I think the way to really emphasize what's important is to come up with relative weight with a scoring mechanism.
Right.
I'm just going to toss out an example. If we group all the criteria into, let's say, 5 groups, because those are rational groups. All things finance, for example, all things destination resort and architecture, et cetera, et cetera. And we come up with a form that lays out those 5 criteria with sub-criteria. Without a relative weight, I suggest that it could be interpreted that we are giving 20% equal weight to all of those 5 criteria. If instead we said this particular criteria, broad one, is of particular importance in the aggregate, that's a real way to emphasize that. Whereas maybe another set of criteria is going to be a prerequisite, or is assumed that everybody will comply in this form or another. That's where the real discretion, if you will, of the commission towards emphasizing what's important is really implemented, in my view.
Yeah.
You know what? I think that's right. I think we differ a little bit on how you score. Do you score it verbally or do you score it with numbers? But I think we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But I think the idea of indicating how important, some way, how important in the overall process we believe, what are minimum criteria, as you said, and then how important do we believe other criteria are in the overall evaluation process is really important.
Yeah.
You know, I think of, and it's not exactly, you know, a match to what we'll be doing, but I know, say, for example, Las Vegas, you know, building lots of high-class golf courses and certain casinos affiliating with those golf courses. So of course you may never be able to get on, or, you know, a TPC, a course that the pros play, but, and groups of golfers who used to go to Florida or Myrtle Beach now go to Las Vegas because of this, you know, you have a little gambling, you have the nice shows and restaurants, and you have these beautiful golf courses. So in a way, that's what we're looking at, only in a singular manner, what other amenities will bring groups of people
Right.
from around the country or around the world.
Yeah.
I you know, moving even in front of the evaluation and the kind of criteria setting phase, you know, it may make sense. You know, we've only at this point encouraged the tourism organizations around the state to at least have some type of, they've only pursued some type of cross-marketing promotional relationship with a potential applicant. You know, it may behoove us to, you know, talk to or invite in Mott and Massport, the people that are focusing on drawing in the international visitor, and begin to put maybe some more meat to the bones of the projects of saying, okay, it's great that we can promote each other, but how can, again, an applicant lend itself to boosting tourism for the entire community, again, by filling that niche or looking at broader plans to market outside of the country. But maybe behoove us to have a conversation with Betsy Wallet, Mott, and Massport to say,
Yeah, well, we've, as
let's
you
keep
know.
the conversation
Yeah,
going.
we've done some of that, but I think that idea, I think maybe that's a good idea to focus and you know, there's two things going on here. We're trying to, you know, work amongst ourselves to really identify the criteria, and eventually we'll figure out how to weight those and rank those. But also, we're trying to give our eventual partners an opportunity to understand, you know, what the rules of the road are gonna be, and try to get them to hear us about what we're gonna really value. So I think maybe having those folks come in and talk to the bidders through us about how they might see these strategic relationships work is a good idea.
I think sharing these three questions, and they may be prompted to think of a few more that we can't come up with, but initiating those three questions to them and seeing what kind of feedback and thoughts and comments they give us. And then eventually, I think you can boil it down to the local tourism boards, who are probably have already had some conversations with potential applicants and really begin to put a more local focus to it.
I would only be sensitive to the notion of timing, to the extent that some of these has to go in regulation, and I'm suggesting that maybe some of it doesn't, but some of it does. We are, you know, already in the timeline, in our timeline, have to be mindful about that, because that these
Yeah.
discussions, if we were to organize a public forum, let's say, that could mean, you know, a few weeks and whatnot.
Right.
So I would be in favor of trying to have those conversations in our public meetings to the extent possible, or by soliciting input, as Commissioner McHugh was suggesting, public input, like we have done so effectively in the past. to make sure that we can adhere and if possible, improve our schedule,
Right.
like we have said as well.
Right.
I agree with that, and I think that we ought to strive to get the policy end of this, the evaluation criteria and the other things done as quickly as possible, so that even before the regulations are done, people can see what the regulations are going to build on and begin and do some planning. They're already planning, no doubt, for to meet the 19 criteria that are in the statute, and they're pretty comprehensive. And it seems to me that we could do that, and then have discussions about what kinds of things fall within the, we ought to think about that fall within the criteria that we're talking about. I mean, there's a million answers to question one. And getting everybody to think about that after we've settled on question one as a useful question is something that can develop, because a lot of it isn't hardware but it is forming relationships and thinking about the environment and the like. So it seems to me we can do both, but I agree that we need to outline this thing quickly so people can continue their planning.
There's some interesting, I mean, we had a vote a couple weeks ago that I lost 4-1 on, that we don't want to open up to increase the one-time license fee. That we made a statement, a very powerful statement, that we would rather see improvements in the capital investment. You know, if there's extra money to be spent, we want it in the capital investment. The legislature set for the casinos a very modest tax rate of 25% tax rate, which fits right in maybe the low middle of the commercial tax rates. I don't know exactly where the casino, where the slots rate falls, but I think that's the legislature saying the same thing. You know, we're not going to hit you up really hard on the tax rate. We want economic development and job generation. That's clearly was the priorities. And those were, and ultimately revenue. And those we're not going to, obviously we don't want to compromise that. But it begins to take together a message that you can convey to the bidders about what we're really looking for here. Because there's other ways to pull money out of the bidders. One is a higher tax rate. We chose not to do that. Another way is to do a bigger license fee. We chose not to do that. It's this kind of stuff that we're looking for, where the real variables are going to be. There's one other thing I just want to mention that I think is important, and we really strove to get competition. We've got it. We want to make the most of that. We're going to play it for all it's worth. I mean, that's why we wanted competition. That's going to be for the good of the people of Massachusetts. I don't have the slightest doubt about that. But we don't want to get greedy. We do have in our mission statement that we want our partners in the business, our eventual licensees, to have a healthy return on investment so they can have a healthy business and make money and be stable and hire more people. And I've told the cautionary tale before about the cable television industry, where the municipalities got greedy and forced people to make promises they couldn't keep in order to compete, and then everybody went bankrupt and none of the promises were kept. So there's a line to be walked, and I want our bidders and our eventual partners to understand that's what we're trying to do here. We want to push as hard as we can, but not to the point of doing damage to the business model. And I think that's going to be the trick for us to work our way through this. So what are specific steps here, just so that I'm clear on it? Should we, how would you turn your last couple of comments into, is there an action, a couple of steps we should take?
Well, I think the first step is to post this memo right away on the web and invite comments. I think the second step is to take a stab at putting these at least the questions in some form into the evaluation criteria.
Yeah.
And I think the third step is to put together the evaluation criteria and have a discussion that'll take everything down a few thousand feet, so that we're looking at more concrete things, grouped as Enrique suggests.
Which will flow from the process that you're starting?
Yeah,
right.
I've already started that, and it follows that model.
Right.
And I want to work with Commissioner Zuniga on some more granularity there. And then see if we can come up with some evaluation criteria that interweave real granularity with real space for creativity, and then figure out how to weight it. And that'll inevitably be a first draft, and we need to discuss it, and then settle on what those are at a pretty firm state, and then ask for public comment on it. Finalize them, and then have a continuing discussion about the kinds of things that we're looking for that meet it. That would be my view as to how we could proceed.
When would you think that could realistically happen?
Well, I think that I was shooting to have the first draft of this criteria matrix next week. It'll be a draft, and we'll need some more work, but I think we'd benefit by a collective look at what's there. I've reached out to a couple of different people. I've got an appointment to see some people early next week. And I would think that within the next 2 to 3 weeks, we could have a good chunk of this done. And that's my target. That's
So
what
we
I
could
would-
have, by maybe the second week in February, maybe we could have something that we could then get comment on and use as a,
Yes, I think we can.
something like that.
I think we can.
Okay. What about having the idea of having Massport and Mott and others come in
I think that's
While that's going on.
That's great if we can do. I think that'd be great to have them come in, and the sooner the better.
Yeah.
Because if we can incorporate some of their ideas into this, and if they can look at what we already are thinking about,
Right.
and talk about gaps to fill or ways to spin out or tease out something that would be helpful without eliminating creativity, that'd be great. A number of this is self-evident, I suppose, but a number of the criteria in section 18 or 19 are sort of yes/no criteria. You have to meet LEED's gold or better,
Right.
and that's a yes/no thing. But others are extremely broad, and there's some ideas for fitting things in there. But that's a place where we could use help, and then things that aren't in the statute, obviously, we're looking for as well.
Right. Okay, great. All right, that's good. I'm glad I asked you. Thank you. That was helpful. We'll follow right up on that. And anybody who's watching is invited to give us ideas on how to accomplish any of these kinds of objectives. Anything else? Application process? I guess we're going to get to the real guts of it later on. So, anything else on this? Number 5, Public Education and Information, Ombudsman Ziemba.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I continue to have meetings and answer questions by communities and applicants. Notably, I reported last week that I was in Springfield last week and West Springfield. The purpose of these meetings are to provide a status report to all parties of the latest initiatives of the Commission. There are a tremendous number of things that we decided in December, and there's a number of other things that are on their way. So I think that the general tenor of these conversations has been really good, and I think that communities have been getting a lot of benefit out of them. I'm scheduled to attend a regional forum with Mr. Grossman this evening, hosted by the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. It may be upwards of 20 to 30 different communities that may be represented there, and we'll discuss a host of issues, such as surrounding communities issues and timelines and definitions, and some of the things actually we'll be discussing in a couple of minutes. Over the next couple of weeks, I'll concentrate some of my efforts on reaching out to some of the new applicants from the applications that we received earlier this week. And hopefully with them, I'll address some of the timing issues of host community agreements, referendums, and the like, and our applications that are due later on this year. The next 2 topics that I would like to address are very much interrelated. If it's okay with the Commission, I would like to just flip the order. I'd like to discuss first the...
John, excuse me, can I interrupt?
Sure.
We had talked, I remember I was keeping notes prior to hiring you about some organizations or categories of organizations that we had all met in our travels, and we were thinking that we might want to have a list of either organizations or categories of organizations to give to all of our bidders, to say, here are people that you might want to be talking to. I think you and I talked about this, and it was like different kinds of environmental organizations, and is there some such semi-list of people who had seen us that we wanted to kind of systematically make sure that all the formal bidders now know about?
We have been mainly concentrating on trying to set up methods for technical assistance through the regional planning agencies, as I've reported in the past.
Right.
In tandem, we've had conversations with other educational institutions, such as the Collins Center. We're in the process of working on a project that they had been working on for quite some time, and that might be another form of technical assistance. I haven't compiled a direct list. I can add that to my
Well, I'm thinking of
list.
the developers, not for the communities. Since I can't think of them, maybe there's not anything there, but I just remember, there are categories like the live entertainment venue group, clearly, to some extent, it's up to the live entertainment venue group to contact all the bidders, but particularly the newer bidders may not even know yet, and it might move the process along if we at least think through the idea of putting together a list of people, as I said, organizations or category of organizations that bidders, it would be in the interest of the bidders and would be helpful to those organizations if they all communicated sooner than later.
Okay.
And I can go back and check in my notes and
Okay.
see who else I think of, but that's an example.
I'll
Because
take a
they're
look.
going to have to talk to all those people, such as the live entertainment organizations. They're going to have to talk to them at some point anyway, so if we can help them all get together sooner than later, that would be good.
That makes a lot of sense.
Compulsive gambling, the Council on Compulsive Gambling. I think there are others. I'll think about that too.
Okay, I'll work on that.
Now that we know who our defined
Right.
group is. Okay.
One of the main thrusts of my conversations with applicants is to get them into the process of talking to the state agencies as absolutely as soon as possible. Obviously, we had that conversation last week about the permitting process, and we want people to start vetting some of the ideas as soon as that they are ready,
Right.
given the short timetable.
Right.
But you very good point on the organizations. I'll take a look at that.
Okay.
So, two items, as I was mentioning, for consideration today are the community disbursements and the draft of the surrounding communities definition. If it's okay, I'd like to take the surrounding communities definition first and then get into the community disbursements. On the surrounding communities definition, what you have before you, this is basically a codification of the policy that we adopted in December as part of our policy meetings. What I recommend on this draft is that the commission, consistent with our discussion in December, we immediately put this out for further comment by all the entities, by as many communities as we can. I'll try to do a very far and wide notification to communities to get their input. We had anticipated that perhaps we would have received some comments just on the basis of the policy memorandum that we put out, but even after some of our efforts, we really didn't receive very many, if at all, comments. But now that this is in the form of a regulation, in that what it will likely look like at the time that we finally adopt our regulations come spring and January, this might give a very, very concrete thing for people to take a look at. So in regard to my brief here, what I'm recommending is not that the commission take a vote on this matter today, but what the commission does is actually put this out for comment. And then after we receive those comments, hopefully we receive those comments, then I will then bring it again before the commission for its vote. So that would be at this stage of the process. And then once we receive those comments and adopt the draft, it will be finally codified as part of our regulations, once our regulations are codified. So in terms of the process for looking at this particular issue, I think by the end of the process, that is a lot of process. But it's probably process that is due, since it is one of the main
most
issues that
important
people are
issues,
concerned
right.
about.
Right.
Okay. Instead of going over all of what we had done before, what I'd like to concentrate on is just a couple of areas of this regulation that let me bring it to your attention. So, with the one item, it's toward the end of the regulation. It is number 5 in the last page. This relates to the community disbursements question. As we discussed last week, this section is included to encourage applicants to provide technical assistance funding to communities before the application process. The definition of surrounding communities, as we discussed in December, we make our final determination of what a surrounding community is after we receive the application. But that leaves the big area between now and that time of who can receive technical assistance funding. So what we do here is we create a special definition that would allow community disbursements to be received by communities that want to evaluate impacts, but they have not necessarily been deemed a surrounding community by us prior to as part of the application review process. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to, even if a community may or may not find its way into an application by an applicant at that later date, that we could, through our mechanisms and at the sign-off of an applicant, provide funding to communities so that they could evaluate impacts, which might be taken into account when we do our evaluation as part of the review of the application.
I thought this was a really good point. I've never seen this before, but I thought it was a really good point. And it makes all the sense in the world.
Good.
Or maybe I have seen it before. If I did, I forgot.
No, it's really a creative solution to a
Yeah.
difficult problem, I think,
Yeah.
and it's I hope that will be the way it's received, but we'll find out when we
We'll
put
find
it out
out.
for the public comment, because it solves a whole range of problems. It's important to underscore what you said a minute ago, though, as a technical matter. These comments that we're getting now and the vote that we take to put this into effect are not the final vote and not the final comment period. That will come as the regulations are being promulgated, the regulation promulgation process. But that said, this is great.
Yeah.
Okay, one other point in here is that sorry, I couldn't print. I ran out of paper at my at my printer earlier today, so I'm relying on my here. But it keeps on blinking off because of our security features. But those are good as well.
Yeah.
But excuse my.
Oh, that's good.
So one other thing that we specify in here, previously there was no specification of how communities would arrive at the commission for the determination of whether or not they are a surrounding community. What this regulation does is it specifies that a community wishing to be designated as a surrounding community must apply to or send a letter to the commission requesting that determination within 21 days after we post the application on our website involving that community. So this establishes a discrete timeline. It allows us to proceed with the application's reviews in the fall, and hopefully that'll be well received by everyone.
Those are the communities that have not yet signed a surrounding community agreement that are still trying to get in the door, right? The others,
That's right.
as the definition suggests, become surrounding communities as soon as the agreement is signed
That's right.
or recognized by
Right.
the developer. Yeah.
And related to that point, sorry.
And those would also be those that did not become limited surrounded community by this point number 5. Because everybody will have the opportunity to encourage, to participate in this limited role
That's right.
to evaluate their their impacts.
That's right.
Prior to
Right.
that time, the time of the application.
And let me point out to you something that is not included in this regulation. If you take a look at number 3 on the last page, surrounding community agreements, we have reserved that section of our regulation. And what this is the protocols and procedures that we are required to write for resolution of disputes between applicants and communities where no surrounding community agreement has been concluded. So we are given a period of days, 30 days, under which the applicant and the community shall work to get an agreement concluded, and at the end of that date, then the commission shall step in and establish protocols and procedures to make resolution of that agreement. So we have not attempted to include those procedures because they need a little bit more work in this definition, and that was outside of the scope of what we talked about in December. But that is something that we really need to get to as soon as we can.
But the protocols and procedures could and should be put in place, at least in regulation, prior to that RFA Phase 2 deadline, if you will.
They have to be.
They will be.
They have to be. And, this draft anticipates that once we get that language ready, that we can plug it right into this draft definition.
John, on number 2, in the middle there, it says, on the front page, it says, Commission will make its determination on open meeting at least 30 days prior. I assume that by at least there you mean not less than 30 days. And I just wonder whether, this is maybe too granular, but is 30 days too long a window? This is a process that we're trying to move along. There would have been a lot going on. Should we have a forced month window between those two things? I don't know where that 30 days came from, but it seemed a little long to me.
I think that was a recommendation from our consultants, our legal consultants, in order to provide surrounding communities the proper notice that we've made that determination, and that we would not hold the general hearing on the entire request until after 30 days after that designation.
Right. Well, we can just plot it on a chart and see if that seems reasonable. It just struck me as it's not like people aren't going to know what's, at this stage of the game, in any given area, everybody's going to be pretty up to speed on what's going on. And
Right.
Struck me as maybe a little long.
I think in reality, the way that it would work is that once we make our determination that a community is a surrounding community, then there also is that 30-day requirement that they enter into negotiations.
Right.
So it's probably not likely that we would want to hold the hearing on the overall application before the 30-day date. So I think
Right.
it may
Okay.
not be that problematic.
Okay. Okay.
So in this regard, I recommend that the commission put this out for distribution for public comment. My recommendation is that, take a look at the timetable, we should at least put it out for 2 weeks. The after 2 weeks, February 7th, is the commission meeting that would be 3 weeks from today. So if we received comments by the latest of the 5th, the Tuesday, the 5th, prior to that Thursday, that should be a reasonable time for people to be able to get comments to us, and it would at least give us a couple of days to collect those comments for distribution to the commissioners.
Okay. Got that?
John, quick question. Actually, 2 quick questions. Under surrounding community agreements, do you foresee kind of defining who that entity is that a developer has to negotiate a host community agreement or surrounding community agreement with? We've had questions raised to us of, again, older governmental entities like water districts and things like that. Can we draw some clarity to it when we get to that surrounding community agreement piece?
Yeah, that's a very good point, yes.
Okay. And then the second thing is, does the surrounding community kind of draft reg as you have it take into account a community being the surrounding community potentially to more than one applicant? Or is there a need to define that somewhere in here, or is it consistent to just say your surrounding community and just allay all fears of a
Right.
different application if you might be a surrounding community from more than one applicant.
When we discussed this matter a little bit when we had our policy discussions in December, and I think what we discussed whether or not we needed any specific procedures to deal with a surrounding community that may be a surrounding community to multiple applicants. And the determination at that point was that all of those surrounding communities would still have to go through each individual process for the negotiation of the surrounding community between the applicant and that surrounding community. So if you have one community that is a surrounding community to one of the applicants and one that is to another applicant, it may actually be engaged in two simultaneous conversations before the commission if indeed it is not included in one of those applications. So it could be involved in two separate protocols and processes process for determination of the finalization of that surrounding community agreement.
And reflecting back on that policy discussion time for a bit, and, you know, is there a necessity or urgency of the commission to obviously urge any potential surrounding community, especially one which may be a surrounding community to multiple applicants, to, again, make every effort to negotiate in good faith, you know, not leave, you know, one applicant kind of high and dry, or, you know, refuse to have a conversation with them. I mean, I'd like to think that's a general message we can encourage, but
I think we've said that explicitly, I think.
We did say that if negotiations failed, and they failed because a surrounding community in that position was favoring one over the other, that we could take into account the disparate terms of the agreements that they were trying to proffer and make our own judgment as to what was fair. So, in a policy sense, we've got that out there now.
Right, and the ultimate risk to anyone who determines that they will not be involved at this stage of the process is that at the end of the game, obviously, we will work as hard as we can to make sure that every judgment that we come out with is fair and reasonable, but it still may be disadvantageous to a particular community in comparison to what they thought it might be had that they engaged in the process earlier, because it might be out of their hands. So it may very well be to the advantage of communities to make sure that they engage in these conversations, and now as soon as possible. And that's part of the message that we will take to communities.
cool.
John, in the memo that you originally distributed, talking about, you listed a series of bullet points of potential examples that could be considered in each of the categories.
Yes.
And then in the reg, you've gone back to a much broader definition. And I kind of thought those bullet points were instructive. Why did you decide, you said, we will evaluate whether A, B, C, D, E, F, and with some text about it in the reg without any of the examples.
The examples may appear to be a little bit buried in the reg, but if you take a look at 2A, B, C, and D, so there's the general statement, which is basically a statement of compliance with the statutory provision. For example, 2A is the
Oh, I
community
see,
is in
yeah.
proximity to the host community and the gaming establishment. And then the examples are the commission may take into
Yeah, I
account,
see,
but
yeah.
not be limited to, shared border, geographic and community distance between the community and the gaming establishment, and between residential areas and the community and the gaming establishment. So all of those
I see, yeah, right. So-
laundry list of factors are included in there.
Yeah.
But again, an important point is that that laundry list of factors are things that we may take into consideration. It doesn't require that each and every determination involve every one of these,
Right.
because they may not exist.
Nor that would be exclusive, right.
Nor that would be
There may others,
exclusive.
right, yeah, right. Okay, good.
So that's my recommendation on the definition.
I don't think we need to vote on that, right? We can just go ahead with that, okay.
Great.
Go ahead and post it.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. And if I could have Mr. Grossman join us for the community disbursement section.
Oh, I don't know.
So you have heard us discuss that the question of what is the form of our community disbursement, what is the form of the technical assistance grant to communities, what form should that take? We've reported in the past that we've been working on the actual form of the grant agreement. Mr. Grossman has been doing an excellent job of making sure that it is in a form that is reasonable and it should be acceptable to communities and to applicants. It follows a format that we've had from the benefit of Commissioner Zuniga from the School Building Authority. And we've also written the cover memo, which is a very short outline of the procedures that the communities should take in tandem with applicants to receive our funding. We've put in a copy of it before you. The recommendation on this is that we still are waiting for final word from the Division of Local Services on the adequacy of this. We think that it's in pretty much final form, if not final form. And we'd like to move forward on it as soon as possible. Perhaps, Todd, if you can give us the benefit of some of the, not every aspect of the grant agreement, but some of the bigger considerations regarding reimbursement, and then the policy that I just spoke to you about regarding community disbursements and allowing funds to go for technical assistance now is also baked into this community disbursements language.
That's right. So ultimately here, we have set up a process that's captured already in the regulations. It's section 114.03. It talks about the letter of authorization. As I mentioned last week briefly, there are essentially two ways that we can ensure that the communities get the funds that were anticipated under the statute, the not less than $50,000. Either by way of a straight reimbursement if the funds have been properly appropriated at the municipal level, which is an easy method for us, where they would simply just say, we've expended these funds, here's the documentation. We make a determination that they are consistent with the intent of the statute, which is for the cost of determining the impact of a proposed gaming establishment and negotiating community mitigation impact agreements. So that would basically be the only standard that we would have to apply to ensure that the funds are within that broad category. And assuming that that's the case and they've already been expended, then we approve it and reimburse them. The second method would be by way of this grant. So they would have not, in theory, appropriated the funds, but they would need the funds to satisfy the impact evaluation. So in order to do that, they would enter into the letter of authorization with the applicant, and we would essentially just be the gatekeeper of the funds. So it really comes down to the applicant and the municipality agreeing on how those funds will be spent. And then we just ensure that it's consistent with the statute and would distribute the funds consistent with this agreement. There's certainly a lot of legalese in there that I think protects us. I think it protects the municipalities as well, and it ensures that the funds are spent appropriately as the statute envisions. And I certainly don't think you want to go through every provision of this agreement, but it does set up a number of things that are worthy of a quick note. It first of all requires us to identify the specific expenditures that are approved. They will have presented that to us. The applicant will have agreed to them already. It provides an audit provision and a clawback provision. So if we could at any time go in and audit to make sure that the funds are properly spent, it requires them to keep good records of how the funds are spent. It allows us to recapture any funds that are unspent at the conclusion of their review process. And it has other indemnification provisions and the like to protect us, and makes clear that by virtue of the fact that we give out this money, we're not accepting responsibility for the review. So that's essentially what this instrument does. as John said, it's consistent in many respects with the agreement that Commissioner Zuniga used for the school funds, and I think it's a solid instrument here. I think it would be helpful to, if approved, to post this on our website so everyone can see what we would expect them to sign if they wanted to go forward with this process. There are a number of other kind of outstanding questions that would go along with this. The first question is, by way of process, once we receive this, how will the commission process the applications? Would we delegate that responsibility to one commissioner in particular? Would you want to look at every application that comes in, or would there be other staff that you would be comfortable having handle this? I know Commissioner Zuniga, I believe, in conjunction with Ms. Golovsky, are setting up accounts for us to handle these funds. So they would have to be done, the review would have to be done in conjunction with those accounts to make sure we have sufficient funds and to request any further funds if necessary. So that's the first issue that I think needs to also be addressed. And secondly, just an understanding of what would happen in the situation where an applicant does not agree to a cost that a municipality feels like they need to review, and what role, if any, we would play in that situation. Or does the commission just leave that in the hands of the applicant and the municipality to resolve? It seems the system that's presently set up is such that we, as I said, are essentially just the gatekeeper, where the municipality and the applicant are in a position to work this out themselves. If an applicant doesn't agree to provide funds to a municipality, whether they believe them to be a surrounding community or not, that they would kind of assume the responsibility for that decision further on down in the process, where that would be a loose end that would be out there when the Phase 2 application is finally submitted. And that seems to be what was contemplated when the community disbursement regulation was put in place. But I think it's important.
Our reg?
Yes. There is no provision in the present regulation for the situation that I just described, where an applicant does not agree to enter into a letter of authorization with a municipality in its entirety, or just doesn't agree to certain expenses that a municipality thinks are important. We kind of leave it to them to figure that out. And I think it's important just to highlight that point.
We do, that's exactly right. But we did not make a decision that that is the way we were going to leave it. We were dealing, and this was before you arrived, we were dealing then with regulations governing the RFA-1 process, and we were specifically dealing with situations in which we got the $400,000 before the application was filed, and surrounding communities and the developers wanted to get at the mutual planning process. So we set up this consensual process to allow them to do that, and left for a later day what we would think about how we would think about the involuntary process. And so that, you're absolutely right, that's the way the regs read now, but that's why they read that way, and we did not make a policy decision that we were never going to have an involuntary process in advance of the RFA-2 being filed. We just didn't cross that bridge.
So should we resolve those two right now? We need to get moving on this, right? Is your intention to resolve those two issues?
Well, I think my recommendation is that we can move forward with the instrument that we have currently, and then when and if those problems erupt, then we'll need to come back to the commission. But I don't think we're in a position of making a recommendation on how that process would work now. But
Okay,
so this document can live by itself,
Right.
but we do understand that there may be issues that need further resolution.
But what about the first one you brought up, which was the issue of what's the process that we approve these at the commission?
Yes,
We need to resolve that today, right?
correct.
Okay.
Or delegate that.
well, we need to decide how we're gonna do it. I mean, I would think that this would be something that we would delegate to the ombudsman with the help of whatever financial staff or lawyers, you might need if you eventually have staff or tap from other people. But I do think the commission ought to sign off on it every week. I mean, if you give us a list, one of your reports is a list of claims, and you've decided whether you approve them or not, and then run them by us and let us approve them at one of our regular meetings. Is that making sense to other people?
Well, yes, in an oversight sense, but it seems to me that these are all by definition consensual claims. In other words, there's no hostile claims that are contemplated by this process. And so getting an accounting periodically from, I agree it should be delegated, and the ombudsman's a logical delegate. But I don't think the ombudsman needs to wait for our approval to make a disbursement of a agreed-upon claim, and needs only wait if he is in doubt about the propriety of the disbursement, notwithstanding the agreement. A claim, monies to build a new gymnasium or something.
Which probably, well, the applicant might agree, who knows?
But,
Okay,
so in an accounting sense, I think it'd be helpful to see where the money's going. But I don't think in a approval sense, we need to wait. That would be my thought.
That makes sense. I would agree with that process.
Yep, I would agree with that too, which is what we
Mr.
envision.
Stubbins?
Yeah, quick question. Calling my city council days, whenever the city received a grant, the city had to vote to accept the grant, but I can't recall whether that was a difference between a institution giving the city money or another governmental agency giving money. But I don't know if that necessarily needs to be a step. I mean, city council accepting the grant on behalf of the city or approving the acceptance of the grant. I don't.
Well, that is one of the clauses, actually, that's built into the grant instrument. So before the city could even sign off, they attest to the fact that they've gone through whatever process they need to go through
Okay.
to accept the money.
Okay.
And I think we can rely on that signature. We don't really need to get into the weeds of that.
Right.
But one of the purposes of the grant that we discussed with local services, that grants, like other grants throughout of state government, they can be expended by communities without having to go through an appropriation. So, for example, a town which relies only on town meeting to do an appropriation, they might have to wait 4 or 5 months before being able to spend monies for technical assistance. And the grant instrument would allow them to spend these funds now when they need to,
Right.
as long as they're consistent with local procedures for spending those dollars.
And that's the genesis of the either or. They can request reimbursement because they appropriate it, or they can go for the grant. They don't have to, they can choose which one.
I think that's an important point, Mr. Chair. I would just kind of add to underscore this conversation. The whole point here, just so everyone is clear, is that municipalities can't just expend money that isn't properly appropriated. That's why we had to come up with this grant process. So we can give them the money under a specific statute that they can expend without appropriation.
Right, okay. I think this is probably something we should vote to authorize. Do you want to move the structure you proposed?
Surely. I move then, Mr. Chairman, that we accept the procedure and process detailed in the memorandum of January 17, 2013 that we've been considering today, and delegate to the ombudsman the responsibility for making disbursements upon receipt of applications that he approves, period.
Second the motion.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Mr. Chair, can I just ask for one? So if for some reason that we need any amendment from local services on this draft document, should we bring this process back to the commission? Or another recommendation potentially could be you could designate one commissioner that could resolve any issues and determine whether or not it requires a full vote of the commission. I have no expectation. We had recent conversations with local services, recent internal conversations regarding this process. It is hoped that this looks like the final document, but
I
just
got
in
you.
order to avoid delays.
Commissioner McHugh, it was your motion. What do you think?
I would think that I would be prepared to delegate to the ombudsman the judgment as to whether or not he ought to come back here because of the nature of the change local services was requesting, and that we simply leave the motion as it is, delegate to him the exercise of judgment, and bring it back to us if we need to, if he thinks we need to do it. And in any event, if there are changes, bring back a copy of the finalized document so that we can post it on the website.
Thank you.
I agree with that. Okay. Great. Anything else?
That's the end of my report.
Those are two major steps.
Yeah,
that-
great.
that-
Thanks.
Really, very, very helpful, I think.
Item number 6, regulation update. Who's this?
I can probably help you with that.
All right, please do.
We discussed the last meeting, the memo, which laid out a process by which we would undertake the drafting of the Phase 2 regulations and the complex gaming regulations as a whole. Since then, I've had discussion with our consultants, both legal and gaming, and an outline has been developed. And we have made preliminary assignments as to who would be responsible for certain provisions. It was, and I will circulate that to you within about a day, probably tomorrow morning. It was, we discussed the best way to proceed, and it was suggested that the Phase 2 regulations, and you'll see from the outline what I mean by the Phase 2 regulations. They include such subjects as the surrounding community regs we just discussed, the designation of host communities, things of that sort, the application as a whole, how the application will be reviewed, a lot of the policy issues that you've already contemplated. That the Phase 2 process will be the most difficult and time-consuming part of the drafting process. So the aim was to work our way through that as quickly as possible. And with that, if we can do that in an expeditious manner, and all hands are on deck to get that done, that the rest of the regulations may be able to move a little more swiftly than perhaps we had even contemplated. So with that in mind, we have come up with a draft schedule for the promulgation of the regulations, which is actually consistent with the schedule, by and large, that the Commission has already approved. The hope is that we can shorten the timeline as much as possible. It's difficult to pinpoint how much we'd be able to shorten that schedule until we really delve into drafting the Phase 2 regulations. And as you can see, some of them are already done. The surrounding community regulations are already done. And that moved fairly quickly. So I think we're hopeful that we can do this quicker than we even thought. But until we actually jump in and start drafting it, it's difficult to set a meaningful goal as to how quickly that can be done. So what we did is we came up with a timeline by which we can ensure ourselves that we will have Phase 2 regulations in place by the time the investigations are done. So we will not be delayed at all in getting the applications out there and the review moving and whatsoever. We would just then have to follow up with the rest of the regulations after we got through the Phase 2 stuff shortly thereafter. So all the regulations would be in place when they were needed, and there would be no delay in the process. So that's the plan right now, and I'll send you a copy of the outline for your review, and perhaps at your next meeting you can discuss that, approve the outline, and any individual commissioners can insert themselves into any specific sections that they're interested in, so we can further break up the responsibilities for the drafting. So that's the plan at this point, if that sounds satisfactory.
I think we'll all be anxious to see the outline and the schedule, but yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
That's what we're looking for.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to say that I've been working with Mr. Grossman on looking at the timing of the, and Commissioner McHugh as well, the timing of the regulations versus the timing of investigations, and I just want to commend Mr. Grossman for frankly being a problem solver, for understanding our mutual needs and putting some things in place that I think that will save us some time, and really understanding the collective goal and working hard toward making that happen when it comes to the regulations.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Anything else on the regs process? Great.
Thank you.
Item number 7, the Investigations and Enforcement Bureau, our interim director.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First item is the scope of licensing. Very busy week from when we reported last week. Lots of meetings, lots of phone calls, lots of discussions, emails, letters back and forth. I want to credit our applicants for being responsive to our requests and getting things to us in a timely manner, and we are doing the same, turning around determinations in a timely manner, listening, taking the meetings that are necessary to understand the issues. There are a couple of outstanding scope of licensing decisions that have yet to be made, but it has not slowed down the process. We are continuing the application review, and in some cases even starting investigations before all of those determinations are made. So that process is working well and nearly complete. With regard to investigations, we reported last week that we had 2 applications which had been reviewed by our team at IEB and had been sent to our contract investigators in conjunction with the state police to start those investigations. I am going to report today that our team, made up of state troopers, frankly, have been working very, very diligently, as well as our new staff attorney, and have completed the application review for 5 additional applicants, and I'll be more specific.
This is for completeness, basically.
This is for, yes, sufficiency in the application itself. Now, there are some deficiencies in every application, frankly. When I talk about deficiencies, paperwork that may be missing, documents that are not legible, they're not clear, qualifier information that may be, needs to be further defined. Just many issues that we are working out back and forth. And again, I will say the applicants are responsive, and we're working on some timeframes, some goals to get that, to get those applications suitable, so that we will not stop the background investigations, because if we turn over to our background investigators an incomplete package, it's very hard to move forward, because there are certain steps you want to take all at once in a background investigation, and if you don't have all the information from all the qualifiers, that just slows down the process. So we are, between today and tomorrow, we will have 5 additional applicants, and I'll be more specific: MGM, Mass Gaming and Entertainment, Mohegan, as well as Hard Rock and Wynn the review will be completed. They will be deemed sufficient and sent out for background investigation to begin. So again,
And the other 2 before that?
We already had Plain Ridge and Penn National complete, and those investigations had started. So that process is working well, the review process. We're getting these out for background investigations very quickly, and the remaining applicants are being reviewed as we speak, and I would hope as soon as next week we'll be in a position to turn those over for investigation as well.
Great.
Right.
Anybody? Two questions. We talked Tuesday night, we told the public Tuesday night that we would review these for confidentiality issues and eventually release the non-confidential information. Do we have any approximate idea of when that might
I
happen?
do. That is part of our regulation. I think there's so much information that is required. Some of the applicants did not send a redacted version. It is a lot of work. All of our applicants have been reminded that that is a requirement, and we've given everybody 2 weeks to get that redacted copy to us, which will have the public information. There's also an opportunity to request additional information to be held confidential, and there's a process according to the regs of sending in a written document if they request additional information, and we'll evaluate that request.
So this is a two-step process. They're gonna give us a version that they think is appropriately redacted, plus
Well,
extras if they
it's-
want it.
It's clearly laid out
Yeah, I
what
know,
is,
right.
and so they
Right.
know what is required,
Right.
and they'll get that document
Okay,
to us.
and then presumably we'll review that and then make them available, yeah, okay.
Yes, yes. And the other, one
go ahead.
more issue, if I may mention, part of this review process helps refine our budget, our forecast for these investigations. Several of them in initial conversations with our contract investigation teams will require additional revenue, and we will be reaching out when we have a pretty substantial forecast. We'll be reaching out and providing explanation as to why this investigation will be more costly than the funds we've already identified. So that will be coming. As we clearly finish up the scope of licensing and we have a better idea of the business entities where there are facilities around the world, and really the kind of investigation that will be needed. And we're working on that now. We'll have a better forecast of cost, and we'll be in a position to understand for each applicant what those costs will be, and we'll certainly communicate that.
Great. The other thing.
Have we identified and posted a schedule of the fees we're going to charge and where these costs are coming from? Has that been done?
Well, that's the intention of this effort that we're undergoing. For the most part, we already have the fees that have to do with our consultants in the investigative piece, and I'm developing additional proration for some of the costs that the commission will incur, and that will be ready in the next few days.
Yep.
But we have not, to answer your question, the answer is not yet.
No, I understand that. But we will have something that we will be prepared to post on the website that tells what the fees are and how we're determining the fees and what the
fees mean the charges.
the charges against the
for the background
400,000.
check?
Right. Our regulations contemplate us posting a schedule of fees so that the applicants, the developers, and the world knows what is happening to the $400,000 and any additional sums that may be necessary. So
Yep.
it seems to me we need to make sure that's done.
Yep.
Well, so were you were aware of that apparently?
Yes.
I didn't remember that. So
Yeah.
if you can fold that into what you're doing, I think that's something we ought to take a look at
Yes.
here and then post after
Right.
that. So
Right.
whenever you get around to it, next week or whenever. The other thing is, there are two applicants who have not declared which license they're looking for. Yet we are moving, at least as far as I know. But we are going to try to do the slots first, which we can't do if we don't know if either of those wants to be a slot. So how do we handle that?
We are again, these were applicants that really moved their process along very quickly in the last week. We were unsure whether or not they would be able to put their deal together in time to make our deadline. So we have not specifically asked. As we review this application, it is an interactive process. As many of you know, I've had conversations with so many of you about the process and what the, whether it be when to get us documents or talking through some of the issues. So we anticipate these two newest applicants, we will have that same process, meaning as we're reviewing that application, we will have conversation, and absolutely that's one of the, although we haven't required that they tell us where at this point, we do think it's important that they tell us which license. I don't think that'll be a problem, and we should, by next week, Mr. Chair, have that information and make sure that our investigative resources are used in a way that we focus on the slots. Again, there is a team for every single applicant, a team of investigators, but we really are emphasizing the slots license first. So we'll have that information by next week.
Okay, and I think we'll make that public, Director Driscoll, when we get that, with those last two. Okay. Anything else on IEB report?
That concludes my report.
How's our new director coming?
For IEB?
Yeah.
We'll start a week from Monday, after giving 2 weeks' notice to her prior employer, but is already actively engaged in understanding what we're doing, and will take place, and will be part of a couple of investigative meetings next week,
Great.
so all is well.
Great. Okay, item number 8, Racing Division report.
We may need one more chair.
There's one right there.
Just
There's
David,
one-
we have one.
David, we have one
Okay.
here, yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. I have a relatively brief transition update. This should probably be our last transition update
Because it transitions over. Great.
because the transition is almost over. We, excuse me. Any remaining physical cleanup activities that need to be done at the facilities that we vacated last week should be completed by the end of next week. We do still have some issues with some of the electronic files that are coming over from the previous agency, but that should also all be done by the end of next week. Other than that, I don't have much to report on the transition, other than it went really smoothly, I think, all things considered.
Good.
Great, that's great.
Item 8B, I'd like to present an overview for you, sort of a reminder of where we were last week and a clarification to the public of what the next step for them is. Last week, we introduced a number of issues to you, and in the packet today, there's a memo that outlines those issues in some significant detail. And tomorrow, we will make sure that on the racing page of the Gaming Commission homepage, there is a clear request for public comment. I think the requests that appeared this week maybe have been a little inconspicuous or unclear, and so we'll make sure that we have good documentation there and a very inviting area for people to make comments. As of 5 o'clock yesterday, we had received no comments, but I think that was a function of the way it was posted. So we will try to be clearer about that.
And these would be
Public
comments, Director
comments.
Dernberger, on the 8B memorandum?
Yes.
Okay.
So this would be the legislative review of the parimutuel and simulcast laws. What we'd like to do today is to focus this discussion on issues that we think, that we brought up last week that we think can be addressed through careful regulation, and then discuss which ones may or may not require amendments or introduction of some statutory language. Before we begin, I kind of want to show you the forest before we start cutting down trees, I think. And so, one of the main issues that we talked to you about last week was the creation of the simulcast license, which is issued to non-racing gaming licensees, and some of the regulatory challenges that we thought it presented to you. And we do think, our recommendation is that we do think that the commission has broad regulatory powers to regulate simulcasting in a gaming licensee. There's some question about whether or not that can be coupled, whether we can provide a regulatory hook to language that appears in 128C, which is the simulcast chapter. To the extent that we're able to do that and do it comfortably and do it well, there is still an elephant in the room, which is that 128A and 128C are set to expire in 2014. Sections 39 and 41 of the Gaming Act have repealed those chapters. So however we couple anything in the Gaming Act to 128C, we still need to protect the authority of the commission in that sense. So that leads to a whole bunch of other issues which we're going to go into here for you, such as equalizing the treatment of different simulcast licensees, harmonizing and modernizing in those issues that we brought up to you last week. So I think I will let David take over at this moment, and I will jump in whenever we see fit.
I raised the question last week as to whether or not we needed to, we couldn't just sail on without 128A and 128C. And so as you get started, I think it's an unstated premise that we do need 128A and C, at least in some form, to provide licensing authority, because that's the only place that you find licensing authority, and without it, we can't, by regulation, put ourselves in the business of issuing licenses and creating new industries.
Racing,
Live racing,
not
live racing.
simulcast, but.
Well, there is no simulcasting license per se, as I understand it, but the racing license and then the simulcast is a right that goes with a derivative of a racing. So this discussion proceeds on an assumption, I gather, that 128A and C, at least the licensing authority in 128A and C, 128A and C, in some form are going to be redone, right?
Yes,
is that I've raised that issue, and I sort of wanted to put it to rest. So
That's a good place to start,
Okay.
actually.
Well, just to clear a couple of points on this, as it, at the last lines on the front page of this memo,
Right.
quotes our Gaming Act, that says the Gaming Act anticipates, quote, the continuation of chapters 128A and C.
In this act, in this act,
Yeah.
yeah, and in this, I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's also clear that 128A and C are repealed as of 2014, and therefore, something has to be done to rekindle them.
Right. But the point that I was going to make is, this is an issue that we've been wrestling with, and because this is one of the issues that we're trying to figure out what the legislative intent was here.
Right.
We are going back and forth with the legislature, trying to get their reading of this as well.
Right.
And haven't wanted to jump in both feet on this until we've had a chance to get some feedback from them. And we're probably all going to read this the same way, but we just haven't got to it yet with everybody, and we want to do that before we take a strong position.
I hear you. Yes.
But it's totally
I
implicit.
understand.
I mean, you said, is it implicit in what you're saying? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's two options, two ways.
Some way.
Two ways to go, and one is whether we tweak individual provisions of 128A and C, or does it make more sense to come up with some sort of comprehensive racing chapter
Right.
that ends this perpetual
Right.
sunsetting and so on. So I think that's a great overview, and that'll help color the discussion.
And the underlying assumption, at least as we take it from the session law provision, section 104 of the session law, is that the commission has a mandate to look at 128A and 128C and to say whether it's effective to do its job in the current context of certainly the racing industry, but through Section 7 B of the Gaming Act, it also incorporates, at least in our view, the simulcasting that is going to authorize. And so I think the commission should expect that, at least on the face of Section 104, that the legislature will look at both of these chapters and our recommendations, or your recommendations, and as the director says, it invites, at least in our view, a rewrite, if that's what is necessary, of both 128A and 128C, independent of this question of whether or not there is sufficient authority to undergird Section 7B simulcast.
And as you know, the only point I'm making here is we don't want to get ahead of the people who wrote this legislation in our interpretation of it, and are therefore it's important that we just take our time on that point until we've had a chance to communicate fully with everybody.
And if I can just add to that we're merely going to make recommendations to the legislature. We obviously,
Right.
the legislature needs to enact whatever it feels is appropriate here. So I don't think there's very much other than what we have said. We need 128A and 128C in our view to undergird the authority for 7B. And there are some structural issues. If we are correct, we need to look at how 128C regulates simulcasting. And at present, it regulates only simulcasting that is the result of having a racing license, because that's all, as presently constituted, Chapter 128C deals with. And so if there are going to be racing licensees simulcasting and non-racing licensees simulcasting, and in that is a mix of perhaps some racing licensees are also going to be gaming licensees, and some of the simulcasting licensees are going to be former racing licensees. We need to, and we have, put a lot of thought into how, if we are going to streamline Chapter 128C, what should that streamlined structure look like? And we have taken some of the lead from the way in which Section 7B of the Gaming Act is structured, how it talks about the involvement of the Gaming Commission in setting the level of takeout that would go into the Racehorse Development Fund to fund the industry, racing industry, and whether or not we ought to borrow some of the design features of that and put them into 128C. So all of that, we have thought a lot about it and we have a lot of ideas, but until we resolve these issues that are still extant and that we're working on, we can't make a recommendation, obviously, as to how and what that structure should look like.
Right. Did you say, did I understand Commissioner McHugh to say that in the absence of 128A and C, we don't even have the right to issue simulcast licenses under 7B? For the
If you probably did understand me to say that because I spoke too broadly. 7B is an independent, a grant of authority to issue a simulcasting license to a gaming licensee. We do have that power. We don't, what I
or
meant
former
to...
license holder.
Yes. And what I meant to say is, in the absence of 128A and C, we don't have the power to issue a live racing license.
Right,
And
okay.
therefore, no live racing licensee can simulcast because there won't be any live racing licenses.
Right, that's the conundrum. Okay, I'm with you on that. I was afraid maybe once again I've lost track of this.
There is, however, Mr. Chairman, something that we ought to keep our eye on as we think about this ultimately to make a recommendation to the commission. While Section 7B clearly involves the commission, at least to the extent of setting the level of takeout, there isn't in the Gaming Act a broad framework of statutory authority to do all of the things that are currently done on the basis of the authority in 128C. And
Are you talking about racing now or simulcast?
actually simulcast.
Even in simulcast?
Yes,
you're-
yes.
128C is a simulcasting.
Yeah.
So that if 128A and C went away, it would invite the question for simulcasting licenses under 7B, what statutory framework or what statutory authority would there be for the kind of regulatory framework that would be necessary in order to regulate simulcasting under 7B? And the answer to that, different people can look at 7B and the structure of the Gaming Act and come to different conclusions. We tend towards the conclusion that we'd be far better off structuring 128C in such a way as to accommodate the Gaming Act simulcasting license and to incorporate that into a revitalized, streamlined 128C.
Well, but the memo makes it quite clear that the regulatory power of the commission is broad.
Yes. No question.
And the statute itself says that in Section 4, I believe it is, that the commission has the authority to promulgate any regulations that are necessary to carry out the powers the Act contains. So while it would clarify things, I guess is what you're saying, if there were a statutory restructuring to accommodate the grant of power in 7B, in the absence of that grant of power, or statutory restructuring, the commission can still do its work insofar as 7B simulcasting licenses are concerned. Do I understand that correctly?
I think what I'm saying, Commissioner, is that in order to carry out some regulatory function, there has to be statutory authority, specific statutory authority for it. So like in the case of the takeouts that are currently authorized under 128C. Without 128C, there is no at least express statutory authority in the Gaming Act that would authorize without argument, let's put it that way, the takeout from simulcasting, other than sending that 10%, minimum 10%, over into the racehorse development.
I understand that. I understand that. That is a tax-like power that has to be expressly embodied in a statute. But the conditions under which a simulcasting license can be issued, who they're issued to, the consequences of issuing them and the obligations of the licensee, those are regulatory things within the commission's regulatory ambit.
Yes.
Although it would be better to have some statutory indication from the legislature as to what they intended us to do, but we could still do it. So I think we're on the same.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we know where we are. I think you all have identified and come up with solutions for all of the sort of operational matters here. There's the big kahuna is what, if anything, is going to happen with 128A and C come July of 2014. That is going to be a decision for the legislature ultimately to make. We have to figure out whether they want us to make recommendations to them on our opinions on what would happen in July and what ought to happen in July. And that's what we're still waiting on, sort of as a heads up from them on that. Okay.
Item 8C, I want to introduce to you some leading proposed regulatory changes as they pertain to veterinary matters, each one is force, medication, and veterinary practices on our racetracks. We put together some proposed changes to 205 CMR 3 and 4. And this letter that's in your packet as item 8C is what would be the notice to the local government advisory council. And I will pause one moment while we're...
I know you sent it by email, but I don't have it in my packet. Maybe. Okay, thank you. Do we need another one? Yeah. That's 22. Thank you.
You guys have...
Oh,
Yes,
we have it.
I have mine.
I've got it, yeah.
So this draft letter here to local government advisory council basically outlines which areas of the CMR are going to be primarily affected, almost exclusively affected, and what these new proposed rules are designed to do. So I would just draw your attention to repealing a current regulation that permits the use of a race day medication. It's an anti-inflammatory medication. Massachusetts, we believe, is the last jurisdiction in North America that permits this practice on race day. So removing that.
Can you check the mics over towards you, both of them? And the other one?
So I'll just repeat that, what these proposed changes would do. They're going to do a lot of things, but the highlights that we think are that we suggest repealing the current regulation, which permits the use of a race day medication. It's a nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory medication that in Massachusetts can be, by regulation, administered to horses on race day. We believe Massachusetts is the last jurisdiction in North America, if not even more globally than that permits this practice. And so by repealing that, it would go a long way toward moving Massachusetts towards the uniformity that the industry is seeking. We have included a provision for a split sample or a referee sample for an owner and trainer. If a post-race testing sample comes back as a medication positive or violation, Massachusetts does not currently require the commission to afford the opportunity for that trainer to send the sample out to another testing lab to verify, confirm, or deny the findings in the Massachusetts sample. So we have included that provision. It basically affords additional due process for licensees. That is industry standard. There are a few jurisdictions that are not doing that, but certainly the majority are. So that's certainly an industry best practice. And it's the fair thing to do. We would be preventing the transfer of horses in a suspended trainer's care to his or her spouse during the period of suspension. Also in industry practice, the betting customer does not like when they find out that the horse that they're wagering on is being trained by the spouse of somebody who has been ruled off or given a long suspension for some sort of medication violation. So this helps protect integrity. And providing clear withdrawal times for accepted therapeutic medications to veterinary practitioners and trainers in the form of treatment restriction windows. So what this does is currently, if you're a trainer or a veterinarian, you know where a target might be, a target level of some medication. If you go over that, would trigger a violation. But it's very difficult to know how far out in advance you stop the treatment of these medications. And these medications that we're talking about are therapeutic medications. So they're the medications that you and I would keep in our cabinets Any sort of athlete suffers from aches and pains, the occasional GI distress, gastrointestinal distress. And so there are medications that are very legitimate to be used on horses in training, not on race day, but in training. And the vast majority of medication violations that we see in the industry are simply the result of being treated too close with some of these therapeutic medications. Doping in horse racing is very uncommon, but the majority of the things that you see and that get the press in the industry are actually overages of therapeutic medications. So the rules that we propose will give the guidelines that the practitioners and the trainers have been seeking. And this is an industry best practice, and Massachusetts will be joining a number of states in rolling out this particular rule. So with your approval, I would like to take the draft. And for those of you who can't see, the A and the T are missing from the draft watermark, but I would like
I
to.
thought it was a whole new code you had.
Exactly.
Veterinarian's code.
Daily
No,
racing
have-
form.
no.
I would like to remove the draft watermark from this, sign it, and send it off to the appropriate addressees tomorrow.
Is there, on the bullet number 3, is there any concern about the suspended trainer's ability to transfer ownership to another family member? I mean, we're protecting against the horse of a suspended trainer run, basically.
Yep.
But is that the only nuance we need to worry about, is just transfer it to a spouse or another family?
The answer is no, and the industry is looking at that. And the Model Rules Committee is looking at some new language, so you're going to start hearing terms like inactive person, which would include people who are suspended, people who did not renew their occupational license, or some other sort of, where there's an administrative something going on. And then associated persons. And so there's a definition of associated persons and how far out those tentacles reach. And it's just striking a balance between what's fair and, there's only so far you can reach. There's only so much is fair for both the betting public, for the regulator, because there's a burden on us, of course, to make sure whether or not this practice is occurring, and for the occupational licensees.
I don't think, we don't need a vote for this, do we?
We're starting the regulatory
Part.
process, and we ought to have a vote that, I think, starts that process. We have the draft regulations. They are now going to be sent to the local government advisory committee. That's what this letter goes to, and that really starts the thing running.
We're initiating.
And we'll set up a comment period and the like. So I would think it would be helpful to have a vote, and so I would move that the commission authorize Director Durenberger to send this letter enclosing the new proposed regulations dealing with the subjects contained in the letter to the local government advisory committee, and otherwise take the steps necessary to see to it that the regulations are properly promulgated.
Second.
Excuse me. This letter doesn't actually convey the full amendments, it just says, sorry.
Is it coming or not coming?
I may need to adjourn this meeting briefly. This doesn't, I was going to ask the question which Commissioner McHugh assumed. Is this meant to convey the whole regulatory change? Because if it does, it doesn't. It just gives these highlights.
Correct, it does. And Mr. Grossman, can you answer that for me?
We didn't intend to forward the draft regulations since they haven't been formally reviewed by the commission. The executive order doesn't require the transmission of the regulations when you can adequately convey the subject matter. So my opinion is that this letter satisfies the obligation of the executive order, and certainly if they're interested in seeing the draft regulations, once the commission has an opportunity to look at it.
And the timetables.
I misunderstood what was happening then, so I withdraw my motion. It hadn't been voted on, it hadn't been passed yet, has it? All right. Go ahead.
So my understanding of the timetable is that given the appropriate lead time to the local government advisory council, I come back to you with the actual regulations, and then we can go over them in whatever level of detail you would like. And we would also propose putting them on the website, inviting public comment on that. There's also a public comment period built in toward the end where the public hearing is. But that's, we're not trying to hide the ball on anyone. It was just, my understanding was that we needed to merely give them notice and certainly be responsive to any additional inquiries that they had. And then we'd be coming back to you in about 2 weeks with the full text of the amendment.
Okay, is the full text of the amendment, what stage are we in insofar as those are concerned?
They are prepared, they're in draft form,
You-
prepared for your review.
They're ready?
Yeah, they're ready.
Okay.
Didn't you
We've-
distribute those over the weekend?
We
I
saw
thought?
them.
Right.
Yeah, those are the ones that I
Yeah.
thought
So
I
is there
didn't have.
any reason we couldn't take them up next week?
Perhaps I misunderstood the amount of lead time that the local government advisory council needed. I'm ready for
No,
next
no,
week,
that
certainly.
internally,
Yes.
There's no reason that we don't have to notify the local government advisory committee before we think about the regulation, right?
You don't have to. This was just a way to get the process moving because there's a 14-day window we have to give them to comment. So this would just be a way to get a week under our belts while we look at it.
Right.
So we get the rest of it.
I don't quarrel with that, but we don't have to wait
2 weeks.
to do anything because we're sending this letter to them right away. So I would recommend that we send the letter, and I'll reformulate the motion, and then put the regulations on the agenda for next week so that we can take another week to look at them and then adopt them, so that if they want to see them, which they may ask to see, we have regulations to give them.
The only thing you couldn't do during this 14-day period is send notice to the Secretary of
Right.
State and publish it in the newspaper
Right.
and things of that
Right.
sort. But you can look at it.
Right.
This is, I think, a response to us saying, is there a way we can look at that schedule and squeeze things down and within the limits of the rules? And so I think it's it's a good step in that direction. It's an easy week.
So I would move that Director Durenberger be authorized to send the letter of January 17, 2013 to the local government advisory committee promptly.
Second.
Yeah, I agree. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it unanimously.
Okay.
And that concludes, excuse me, I'm all choked up. That concludes the Racing Division's report this week.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody need a break? Are we all set?
I would like to just take a 2-minute
All
break.
right, we'll have a brief adjournment. We'll be back in 5 minutes or so. Okay, we will reconvene, public meeting number 46. And we're at item number 9, other business, which is reserved for matters the chair did not reasonably anticipate at the time of posting. I'm required to post our agenda 48 hours, business hours before the public meeting, and that didn't give us time after our meeting Tuesday night when we got all these waiver requests. So we filed a supplemental agenda, which we posted also, and would like now to bring up item number 9, which was the several requests for waivers that were filed in our offices on or about the end of the day on Tuesday. And we've asked Commissioner McHugh to walk us through these requests and invite and we will all then participate in the conversation as he walks us through these. So fire away.
I wonder, Mr. Chairman, if I could begin by asking Ombudsman Ziemba to join us for a minute. To put in context some of the processes. This morning, yesterday or this morning, after we had posted this, John, I asked you to reach out and let people know that we were going to be taking this up today. So could you just briefly bring us up to date on what?
Sure. I contacted representatives of all 4 of the requests for extension earlier today. I either spoke with them or left messages and an email for representatives. In addition to making those phone calls, I also contacted the host community that is known in regard to the one of the applicants, or excuse me, two of the requests for extensions, the city of Holyoke, to let them know that it would be discussed today and that our discussions would be based on the items that we received. Just prior to coming over to the meeting today, we received a letter from the city of Holyoke that relates to these applications.
And that letter has been provided to all the commissioners and be available for everybody, copies will be available for members of the press. All right. And so if you wouldn't mind staying there for a minute in case we come to any factual issues. But let me then, Mr. Chairman, set the stage. We received these 4 requests from people who did not file an application or in one case, file with the application a check by the deadline of 5 o'clock on the 15th, and instead received these requests for extensions of the time to do so. There, under our regulations, are 2 applicable provisions, or 2 provisions that we need to think about. The first is found, for those who keep score on these things, in section 111.016, which provides that the commission may, in its discretion, extend the time for filing a complete application to enable an applicant to cure a deficiency in its application, provided that the application was submitted and the applicable fee paid before the established deadline, or to provide a reasonable additional time for filing in cases in which extraordinary circumstances prevented a timely filing. So under that regulation, either people who filed their application and paid their fee can have an additional amount of time to, in our discretion, to do necessary things, or if there are extraordinary circumstances, we can extend the time for filing. Section 102.03(4) provides the commission, again in its discretion, with the power to waive or modify any component of its regulations, including deadlines. And the commission, in exercising that power, has, by regulation, said that it will consider 4 factors. Whether the waiver is consistent with the statute, General Laws 23K, whether granting the waiver will not interfere with the ability of the commission or the Bureau, that's the IEB, to fulfill its duties. Granting the waiver will, whether the waiver will adversely affect the public interest, and whether failure to grant the waiver would cause substantial hardship to the person requesting the waiver. Now, those are cumulative factors. There's not one factor that points in one direction, but those are the things the commission has undertaken to take into account in deciding whether to grant a waiver or not. So that's the regulatory framework in which we're considering these, and I thought it would be helpful simply to go through them one by one and deal with them in that fashion. The first request is embodied in a letter from Mayor Michael D. Bissonette of the city of Chicopee. And his letter, which is, and all of these are part of the packets that are available and which have been distributed, says, and I'm going to read just some of the highlights of this instead of the entire letter. As you are aware, I have long advocated for the prospect of the city of Chicopee hosting a resort casino development. Skipping now some background. The impetus for my outreach to you today is that within the last 7 days, I've fielded a very strong and legitimate expression of interest about a potential site in our city, just taken under option, that warrants my serious consideration and that of our residents. I respectfully request that the Gaming Commission grant the city the additional time we need to work with the site owner by allowing a late application to be filed for a casino development in Chicopee. And he goes on to say that he's aware that it's a late request, it's at the 11th hour, but the circumstances recited in his letter are those that on which he bases his request. So that is the first of the waiver requests. It seems, well, I'll open that for discussion then, if you'd like, or I'll go through and make a recommendation.
I think if we'd start with your recommendation would be good.
All right. It seems to me that this request is understandable from the mayor of a city who is trying to advance the interests of the city, but it does not fit within the concept of extraordinary circumstances as the first of the regulations that I mentioned requires. The second thing, in my view, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, is that under the four-part test I articulated, granting the waiver would adversely affect the public interest. And it would do so, and this is going to be a common theme that we need to think about today. This is an interlocked process. We are trying as hard as we can to move forward expeditiously to achieve the goals that the statute requires and issue these licenses. But in a competitive process, one really can't decide how to approach the license issuing decision until all the competitors are in the field. So to give somebody an opportunity to file a license application at some place down the road that's not defined, and to hold that on the hope that some deal may come to fruition that would allow the person seeking the postponement to file an application, or to have a developer file an application. The mayor's not going to be the applicant. Would, it seem to me, endanger the process of moving forward without any end time in sight. And so I would recommend that, in consideration of all of the factors that we're required to consider, that we deny this request for for the extension.
I'd like to speak to that also. I would agree with Commissioner McHugh that I don't see this as a, what is the word you used, Commissioner McHugh, from the first part of the
Extraordinary.
regulation? Extraordinary?
Extraordinary
circumstance. In fact, in an interest in fairness as well, there were a couple of other developers slash folks from cities that were trying to put a deal together, met with us as far as scope of licensing, but were not able to make the deadline. They could not, and understood. They thanked us for our meetings with them, but explained that they were not able to put the deal together in time. So there are others, that have been in the same situation and have respected our deadline and understand what the rules are. So I would agree with you that this request, certainly we understand the need for mayors to advocate for their cities, but it strikes me the same way that it is not an extraordinary situation.
I would agree with that, and I have 3 points to make to the recurring theme that you allude to, Commissioner, that are really along those lines. The deadline has been reported accurately and in place for months. Since our September 10th hearing that was well established, the deadline did not move. We did not change it anytime before that. So I doubt that it created confusion. There's one piece perhaps that was not widely understood, but it was certainly understood by some of our applicants, which was that a site need not be secured to become an applicant. The only requirement was the filling out the multi-jurisdictional form and the Massachusetts form, which was clearly stipulated in our website for all those months that I referred to. So I am disinclined to entertain any waivers, and we can speak more about each one of the other ones for all those reasons.
Mr. Stebbins, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I've personally, at least over the television, heard of the mayor's interest and actually his extending an invitation through the media to find a potential operator to locate in the city of Chicopee. Who knows, perhaps he could talk to one of our applicants who hasn't necessarily decided where they would choose to locate, but.
That's an important point, by the way. I mean, anybody who is a bidder can go anywhere. They don't, and there are two bidders that haven't even picked a site yet, so far
Right.
as we know. So that's an important point, and the people who have picked a site can pick a new site if they want to.
But, in terms of, I don't need to harp on the points or reiterate the points that have been made by my colleagues because I'm consistent with their thinking, but, we've been encouraged to move ahead with great speed, and applications or requests for waivers kind of just extend that process out even further and further. And I think to reemphasize Commissioner Zanika's point, I mean, people have known through the media, through our website, through any number of public hearings, what our fast and hard deadline was, except for, again, barring any extraordinary circumstances.
I would just add a couple things. One is that I think the mayor anticipated this in his own letter, but we would be, if we were going to grant a waiver to somebody, we would grant it to an applicant. We wouldn't grant it to the city.
Well, could I just speak to that, because now we've had three comments along the same lines, two that everybody's known all along, and then this one. And that's the mayor raised in his letter, that some may say that he doesn't have any standings and any right to come in to ask for a waiver because he's not an applicant. I think our regulation on its face doesn't limit who may ask for a waiver to any specific person. It says the commission may, in its discretion, waive any provision or requirement. And so I think we ought to think substantively on this and consider the mayor as somebody who has a right under our regulations to request.
It's a good point. I understand that. But if he had come in with a party, that would have.
Yes.
Wait, but I hear your point. We're not standing on principle.
Right.
We're not standing on a technicality.
Right.
It's the
Right.
substance, and I agree with that. And on that point, you said something which, or I heard something. You made it sound as possibly that you were saying because there wasn't a date certain, he had this open-ended request, that it was because of the lack of a date certain that you felt like we shouldn't. Are you suggesting that were there a date certain, you would feel differently about this?
I don't think I would, but the point is there isn't.
There isn't, okay.
And that's one of a number of factors that underlies my it's one thing if somebody says, I can have it to you by the end of the week. And then you apply those four factors to that. But if there's no end date in sight, it is a different story.
Okay, I get that distinction too, and that's important, and I didn't want to suggest that.
Right.
Right, okay. All right, so I think we will be voting on this. Commissioner McHugh, do you want to frame a?
Yes, the motion would be quite simple, Mr. Chairman. I would recommend that the request for an extension of the deadline contained in the letter to the commission sent by Michael D. Bissonnette, Mayor of the City of Chicopee, the Honorable Michael D. Bissonnette, dated January 15, 2013, be denied.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
All right, the second is from the letter was written by Michael Friedberg on behalf of Good Sam's Casino, Inc. And I'm not going to repeat the statute, the regulatory framework, the same regulatory framework applies to all. And this, in this letter, on behalf of Good Sam's Casino, Mr. Friedberg says essentially as follows, and I'll summarize it again as I did with Mayor Bissonnette's letter. Good Sam's Casino is formally requesting that the commission grant Good Sam's an extension of time to come forward with its $400,000 entry fee into the license application process. The letter then briefly recites the proposition that the target destination for this casino is Holyoke, that the Holyoke mayor has taken different positions in so far as casinos in Holyoke are concerned, that his current position is that he does not choose to engage in negotiations with a potential developer for a Holyoke casino, that in the author's view, ultimately the people ought to decide this issue, not the mayor, and that there is going to be a special election to fill the seat.
There may be.
There may be a special election to fill the Senate seat currently occupied by Senator John Kerry, and that the petition, a petition to allow casino gaming in Holyoke may be wrapped into and folded into that. And he therefore requests a 6-month extension of the time for paying the entry fee to let that process play out. My analysis of this is the same.
Could I ask one question?
Yeah.
Is this distinguishable from WM Development? In which case, should we deal with them in the same together?
Separate requests.
Well, I know they're two separate requests, but they're the same fact pattern, and I just wonder whether.
They are the same fact pattern, except that WM Developments has a the additional. Well, let's deal with them separately, so
Okay,
the
fine.
record is
Fine.
clear that we're
Fine.
dealing with them
Okay.
separately. The same principles
Fine.
apply,
Okay.
but let's deal with them separately. This is entirely speculative as well. We don't know when an election's going to be held. We don't know if there's going to be an election, because there's a confirmation process in the offing, and there's reasonable expectations as to what is likely to happen, but that's way out beyond our jurisdiction. And a 4 or 6 month postponement of an application would raise havoc with our schedule for Region A for the reasons I just articulated before. We would now have to wait 6 months to start an investigation, provided that a application were filed. These applications take time, and so we'd be looking at the end of the year before we could, in all likelihood, before we could issue the RFA2 process, and that would throw Region A way off. And so it seems to me that the public interest would not be satisfied by granting this application for an extension, notwithstanding the undeniable fact that it's a hardship to the applicant. So I'd recommend that this one be denied as well.
I would agree for all those reasons. I could just leave it at that.
I concur with the analysis as well.
I do too, I think.
No opponent?
Yeah, I'm afraid we're not going to take comments. We've got the applications here, we've got long letters from people, and we're not going to have an individual contribution on this.
In the statute, Mr. Chairman, as Judge McHugh pointed out, extraordinary circumstances has arisen here.
Yes,
But that's he understands that, we understand that. That's what we're going to talk about, whether or not these are extraordinary circumstances. We've thought about whether or not we wanted to have this an opportunity for a public conversation, and we've decided that we do not want to do that. So we have your thoughts here, and we will consider them, but we're not going to have a public conversation with you about it.
Will it be a private one then?
I don't know.
Just want to be in.
Just to add, I agree with that point, and what I was going to say is, I think this application and the next one do raise some, legitimately difficult circumstances that transpired in the local community, but we've gone through this many times where the legislature made this a local decision and a local process, and we have many times pulled ourselves out of local issues out of deference to the right of the locals to conduct these processes the way they choose to. Sometimes it works well and sometimes it
Mr.
doesn't.
Chairman,
That's an important part of this.
There have been 5 mayors that have considered having
Yeah.
a casino in Holyoke.
I'm familiar with the story, I'm sorry. I'm sympathetic to the circumstances, but we're not going to get into a public conversation about it right now.
All right, the next petition is from the
But
Nicolai.
we need to. we
Oh,
need to
I'm
vote.
sorry.
Yeah. Were there any other comments on?
All right, so I would move that the petition of Good Sam's Casino for an extension of 6 months to file its application and application fee be denied.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
All right, Mr. Chairman, the next one is from the Nicolai Law Group on behalf of WM Development Company, also known as Paper City Development. This, too, is a petition that looks at circumstances that arose in Holyoke, details in a good, thorough narrative form the entire progression of the discussion in Holyoke. The mayor's positions and the change in the mayor's position. But it adds to the other one a note that the Holyoke City Council has decided to put a casino ballot question before the residents at some point in the future. It too will be tied to the upcoming special election for the seat being vacated by Senator Kerry. The petition makes that assumption, but that is what I gather the city council assumption they've made as well. In any event, the proposal is to tie a vote on whether Holyoke should have casino gambling to the upcoming vote, if there is one, with respect to a replacement for Senator Kerry. I don't see any difference, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, between this petition and the last one that we considered. It seems to me that to delay this and to allow the extension sought here would have a negative effect on the public interest, and that it ought to be denied.
Any other conversation?
Just real briefly, Mr. Chairman, to disclose to my colleagues, I am familiar both with the attorney for the law group that represented Western Mass Development and also two of the principals of Western Mass Development. I disclose that at least interaction or familiarity I have with those individuals, but I don't feel that it excludes me from taking action on this. In light of the new information, I think surrounding the information with respect to a referendum or a new referendum to be put before the voters, I think there was still an opportunity that such a referendum even needs mayoral approval. So to cast even another question mark in terms of the process going forward. Understand the predicament that they'd faced, and certainly they've been very thoughtful in terms of disclosing their project and where it was intended to go and what they thought the benefits were.
An additional point to that point is that they're proposing a non-binding ballot question. So by its very nature, it would be non-binding.
Right. And this was what Mayor Morse wrote about in this letter we got at the last minute. That's, for what it's worth, saying that he would never negotiate a host community agreement with any community, and urging us not to be supportive of this. To me, that's not of particular interest one way or the other, but it is there on the record. So I would just reiterate what I said before about, the legislature told us that these issues were to be resolved at the local level. It's a process that the locals determined, and for good or ill, that was what happened. There were So I'll leave it at that. So
And underscoring that is that the host community agreement, which is an essential predicate to getting a gaming license, must be signed by the governing, or the governing body after that agreement is signed, must call for the election on the host community agreement, and the mayor is part of that governing body. So that underscores your point, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
So I'd move, then, if there's no further discussion, that the petition for an extension filed by WM Development Company, LLC, also known as Paper City Development, trading as Paper City Development, be denied.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
And opposed? Nay? The ayes have it unanimously.
All right, the final one is from Sun Moon Casino and Resort, actually, the CFAN Trust, DBA Sun Moon Casino and Resort. Their issue is somewhat different, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. They are seeking an extension of 30 days based on an assertion that they were unable to file their fee in the amount of $400,000 because the funder, the person who was to fund that request, died shortly before the application deadline. And as a consequence, they were unable to get from him the money they needed in order to file their application. They are requesting an extension of less than 30 days and say that they will provide their check within that period of time. This one is a little bit different and a little bit closer call, at least on the face of it. But the application piece that was filed, and there was an application filed, was broadly nonconforming and evinces no real ability to follow through on a gaming application, a gaming application in which the qualifying information is present. And it would be one thing if the application were filed and the application were in reasonable shape even, and this unfortunate event occurred and the money was unavailable. But on the basis of what we have and on the basis of the content of this letter, I think there's no realistic possibility that the application is going to proceed. And it is under those circumstances that it would not be in the public interest to delay the processing of applications even for the 30 days that's being requested. And I therefore would recommend that the application be denied.
I didn't realize that there had been an application. Can you tell us something more about what it was or was not?
It was very limited. There had been no interaction with this. We're not sure it is a company. We have it because it was last minute, just before 5 o'clock.
There was no qualifier meeting?
There was no qualifier meetings, no understanding of a company structure that was not provided. It was a large chart that was provided, a map. It just was not in the form we had requested, and it was very limited in nature. And I agree that I am certainly not comfortable that this is a legitimate, I don't want to say that they're not legitimate, but they have not provided enough information for us to determine if they would be serious in the process. The information they did provide was not in keeping with what we had asked, or we required, not asked. And I would agree that this is not a circumstance under which we should make it an exception for an extraordinary circumstance.
Other comments?
I agree with all of that. I mean, I repeat my initial point about how the form of submission was widely available in our website ever since we posted it in September, and has been for many days. So I would concur with the analysis and the and the suggestion and the recommendation.
In reviewing the letter and the request, I guess what I didn't see is, even despite this individual's death, I would assume, based on my experience dealing with the states, that there's still no guarantee that the individual's resources would be used to pay the permit application, whatever that individual's will may also. They did say, just for a correction though, under item number 4, would preclude this entity from submitting an application for a casino license in Massachusetts for at least 15 years. I don't see that information as being accurate, but as they argue a hardship. Again, not knowing where they plan to be or.
Say that again, Commissioner, I didn't follow that.
Under number 4,
Yeah.
it says the trust would certainly be precluded from submitting an application for a casino license in Massachusetts for at least 15 years. That to me is not accurate. I mean, maybe it's not our place to communicate that back, but we still haven't decided whether we would issue a commercial license in Region
Oh, I see,
C.
good point, okay.
You know, we may find the current applicants aren't successful and
Good point, okay.
rebid a license, so.
Excuse me, Chairman, members of the commission. I'm very sorry to interrupt.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but you've heard me speak before. We're not going to have an interactive conversation here, I'm
I just
sorry.
wanted a point of clarification. That was just a funder, it's not the funding. That was only for the $400,000 application fee. The funding is already available for the payment of the fee. And this just provides the opportunity to go forward to submit the other information that does represent its qualifications.
Okay, thank you. I think the point here is that the death of a funder could be an extraordinary circumstances. Surely that is the kind of thing that's foreseen if in the rest of the context were persuasive. And what Commissioner McHugh and Commissioner Cameron are saying, the rest of the context is not persuasive, did not comply with our standards. And independent of the 400,000, this would not be a go-forward opportunity.
Given additional time, all of the rest of the information will be provided.
Yeah.
Well,
All right.
the basis for my motion, Mr. Chairman, is that the piece that was capable of compliance wasn't complied with by the deadline. And that is in and of itself a circumstance that I think we have to take into account and use as a basis for our deciding whether in our discretion we want to extend the deadline. And if the application had been fully conforming or substantially conforming, and a modest extension of time to pay the fee were all that was being requested, that would be one thing, but that's not this case.
Right.
So I would move, if there's no further discussion, that the application of Sun Moon Development of CFAN Trust DBA Sun Moon Casino and Resort be denied.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes carry unanimously. Okay, and there's nothing to do with the mayor's letter. So I think that concludes item 9. That concludes other business. Anything else, anybody?
Could I
Sure.
go back to an administrative, just as part of the administration on the schedule? We had very brief discussion. I just wanted to note that we did complete successfully our milestone, very important milestone of January 15. And perhaps somebody who is not always recognized but works very hard behind the scenes is Janice Riley, our Chief of Staff, who makes all of that possible, and just want to publicly recognize her.
Thank you.
Here, here.
I agree.
Here, 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 here.
It's,
Good job, Chief.
some people just get things done. Make no noise, just get things done.
Yes.
Thank you, Commissioner Zuniga. We all agree with that. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Second, and then favor?
All right, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Great job.